So I'm not going to go into too much detail about Stevie Ray Vaughan himself. Vaughan was a highly committed blues guitarist from Texas who began his career with various Dallas area bands as part of the club and bar scene in the mid-60s. He performed in several touring acts before finally forming Double Trouble in 1978, whose members would eventually settle down to include drummer Cliff Slayton and bassist Tommy Shannon. The band focused on renditions of blues classics, covers of iconic rock guitarists, and an array of original works. Tragically, Stevie Ray Vaughan died in a helicopter crash along with the pilot and 3 other passengers after finishing a concert at the Alpine Valley Music Theater in Wisconsin. It was early in the morning on August 27, 1990. That date will come up later. Vaughan himself had a particular look about him, a wide-brimmed black hat, often adorned with metal accents, loose-fitting long-sleeve shirts, and very personalized guitars often built from a mix of early 60s Fender Stratocaster components. And you may be curious as to why I go into details about his appearance and choice of guitar. It's because I was into something else in 1990, something that would reconnect me to Stevie Ray Vaughan in an unlikely way several years later. And to explain this, we have to go forward a few years, and then backwards, and then back forwards again. I wasn't the right age to appreciate the blues in 1990, but years later, deep into college and work, that would quickly change. Not because I studied music or ran a register at a record store. When you go to class during the day and then work a very unflattering or underappreciated job at night, you develop a disposition that prepares you for the blues. You see, blues is the music of late evenings, long hours, and lonely commutes home, of noir and neon, of hangovers and hunger. Houston is a big city, and when you enter the workforce, you tend to be thankful for whatever job you can get. And that work can take you on a long commute. It was on those late weekday evenings in the late 90s that I learned to appreciate the blues. A good song on the ride home can mean a lot, and when Stevie Ray Vaughan came on the radio, it just made the night complete. Sure, I could have bought a tape for a few bucks, but the right song on the radio at just the right time was like winning a little prize. Something else happened in my life in the late 90s. My parents moved out of Houston, so I got an apartment along the West Loop so I could finish college. That meant going through my room and picking out all the things that would be staying with me in Houston and what would end up in a box of my parents out of town. Looking through the Shadowrun and MechWarrior titles I'd collected since 1990, I came across an image with a particular message that caught my eye, and then another, and then another. A certain consistent figure began to emerge in my Shadowrun books, one I hadn't even thought about before. I wasn't in a position to research this very much back in 1998, but the internet is different now. You can connect with people who shared the same interests from that era, you can do so much more research on older publications, we have cheaply available PDFs, and even free previews. And so with these new tools, I have spent a few weeks researching Shadowrun, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and the artists who chose to make him a part of that game setting. And in doing so, I learned a few things about the artists that gave that setting its unique look. Facet Corporation was a Chicago-based publisher of paper and dice role-playing games, as well as tie-in boxed games. Prior to Shadowrun, the company had 2 game series based on existing properties, Star Trek and Doctor Who. Facet also produced the Battletech and MechWarrior games, but the early editions of these were heavily dependent on art licensed from the Macross series, as well as select other anime. Shadowrun represented Facet's first wholly original game setting. The game pulled an array of fantasy and folklore elements from multiple cultures and blended them into the cyberpunk fiction of the 80s, then set the whole thing in the far-off future of 2050, which is not actually that far off anymore. While Battletech's art helped set the stage for a very lived-in and war-torn galaxy, Shadowrun is a smaller, more intimate setting, with many early books heavily focused on just Seattle. Source books covered more than just new gear, vehicles, and spells. They fleshed out the crime, music, fashion, sports, film, and television of 2050, as well as the new technologies of Trideo and SimSense and the trends that arose out of those branches of entertainment. 2 of the first edition adventures, Total Eclipse and Mercurial, are even built around indie bands and pop stars. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that music and musicians contribute to the art of Shadowrun, including one that I didn't even notice until 1998, Stevie Ray Vaughan. There are references to a couple of other bands and musicians as well, which I'll make some effort to cover. But which artist or artists chose to put Stevie Ray there, and in which books do these tributes appear? For this video, I'll be covering the fastest Shadowrun releases from 1989 to 1992, as well as the artists who contributed works to the setting. FASA did release some dual 1E, 2E books in 1993, but those are more a reflection of the 2E art and book format, so I'm cutting the year off at 1992. Now, paring down the exact date for these books is a little bit tricky. Some sources list the release year, and some have the publication year, and some of my sources' books were published overseas and may have a different date as well. Tracking down sources for all 30 works is a bit difficult since I never owned all of them in the first place, and I think I may have sold some to a secondhand shop years ago. But at this very moment, I have 4 of the books in my office. The Core Rulebook, the Street Samurai Catalog from 1989, Rigger Black Book from 1991, and Shadow Tech from 1992. Outside of the books, I have the box game DMZ, which is especially important to this video. I also have 2E's Fields of Fire and one other notable book, which I'll cover at the very end. I've bought various RPG books and gotten humble bundles from drivethrurpg.com in the past, and the great thing about their website is that you can preview 4 to 6 pages of almost any book in their inventory. But even if DriveThruRPG had every book, there is still one work they can't reproduce, 1989's GM Screen, which came packaged with this short adventure, Silver Angel. DriveThruRPG is also missing several adventure modules, most notably 1989's first edition DNA DOA, which features the game's KKK surrogate, the Humanist Polyclub, who embraced many of the unsavory symbols of the 20th century.
Hey guys, Freddy here. Welcome back to another Retro RPG. And the end of another week, the end of another poll, and you have no idea how good it is to say that.
In my search for other sources for the unavailable books, I ran into a YouTuber named Freddy who runs a channel called RPG Gamer, where he offers high-resolution page-throughs of the games he used to run with his mates. Freddy's RPG Gamer channel provided not only Silver Angel, but also DNA DOA and several other works that aren't available on DriveThruRPG, including the supplemental loose handouts that came packaged with Universal Brotherhood. So a big shout out to Freddy and his channel. You'll be seeing more than a few clips and screen caps of his in this video. He also has a great collection of news videos and clippings from the 80s on the D&D scatter, as well as page-throughs from other RPGs that he's run. Freddy does have a video on Total Eclipse, but unfortunately he skips the credits page, so I had to find one more source for that adventure module, the Shadowrun Fandom Wiki, which is not a first-hand source. I've also checked creator pages on RPGgeek.com for other games these artists may have worked on, but it's also a user-edited second-hand source. So we have a list of 39 artists and 30 books. How do we start the process of paring down where the Stevie Ray Vaughan tribute images can be found and who made them? High-resolution images of every Shadowrun 1E product are fairly easy to find on a Google image search, so I had no trouble verifying that there were no SRV-related graffiti or likenesses on any of them. This allows us to exclude any artists who only provided cover art. Starting with the very first cover, Larry Elmore. It made sense to hire Elmore for the core rulebook cover since his art had previously set the tone for Dungeons & Dragons on the classic Red Box basic set and other works. His Shadowrun cover art would be reused for the second edition in 1992. Elmore also provided the cover of 1991's Native American Nations Volume 1. The 2 works are his only contributions to first edition Shadowrun. He has a website where you can view his various module and novel covers and buy prints, and his art is also heavily featured in the D&D Art and Arcana book. Dave Lohman is credited with the cover art for the 1999 adventure module Dream Chipper. I was not able to find any additional information about him or any samples of his art, unfortunately. David Dorman is credited with the cover art for 1992's sourcebook Shadow Tech. RPGgeek.com lists him as a contributor to a multitude of other works for Fantasy Flight, West End Games, TSR, and others. He has his own website, davedorman.com, where you can find links to his art and his book Oil and Water. Nick Smith is credited with the cover for 1992's adventure Imago. He also provided the cover to the second edition Tirnanog sourcebook. It can be tough to pare down exactly which Nick Smith artist he is, but you can see more of his credits on RPGgeek.com as the third Nick Smith entry. I haven't found much else about him though. Roger Motzkus is credited with the cover of the 1991 adventure Total Eclipse. Motzkus has done illustration work for books, ads, movie posters, and a range of other commercial products, and you can find his art at motzkusart.com. I definitely remember more than a few of these ads showing up in my comic books in the 1990s. And that brings us to the king of first edition cover art, John Zalesnik. Zalesnik provided cover art for 1989's DNA DOA, 1990's Grimoire, Universal Brotherhood, Queen Euphoria, and Bottle Demon, and 1991's Dragon Hunt, Ivan Chrome, and 1992's Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life, and the cover of the DMZ box set. Zalesnik has a website, johnzalesnikart.com, where he features samples of several works, including ones from Magic the Gathering and Rifts. That's it for the cover exclusive artists though. All the remaining cover art was provided by artists who also contributed interior art at one point or another, and that's 6 checked off our list. One thing I recall about the Stevie Vaughan art is that it showed up only in the hand-drawn illustrations. This allows us to pare down another set of artists, those who contributed design work, photographs, or computer-generated work. This category of artists is shorter, but still has a couple of notable names. To start with, we have a pair of institutions rather than artists. The first is Aardvark Studio, who are listed as the source for maps in the adventure Imago. They're also listed as providing maps for Dark Angel, but I can find little else about them. Yates Photography is credited with the color photos for 1991's London Sourcebook, which you can see here in Freddy's video. London Sourcebook is interesting, as much of the art is done in the style of travel ads, newspaper ads, or transportation ads. The London Sourcebook isn't the first one to feature photographs, as that honor goes to 1989's Sprawl Sites, which had photos of miniatures. But having actual models is a novelish choice. There are so many businesses called Yates Photography these days, even just in the city of Chicago, so I don't have anything else to offer about this company. Brian Peterson and a company called Peterson Design are credited with the interior illustrations of some of the color sections of 1992's Shadowtech Sourcebook. Shadowtech features several organic and interior hologram-style illustrations, which would look fairly advanced for 1992. Remember, this is 2 years before 1994's reboot TV series. Shadowtech is the only credited RPG work for Brian Peterson on RPGgeek.com, and the comment I makes other internet searches difficult, so I don't have anything else to add about this artist. But now we come to David McCoy, a computer graphics artist who did the cover of 1991's Virtual Realities and the Rigger Black Book, as well as many other supplements after 1992. He is sometimes credited as Dave McCoy. He produced several interior color CG images for the Rigger Black Book, which closely match the sketches used in the vehicle listing, which does make me wonder how many of the vehicle listings are just sketches done over McCoy's CG artwork. Finding information about Dave McCoy is actually pretty easy. He's been actively involved in video game production for over 25 years. He's a founder and art director of Hidden Path Entertainment and previously worked on several MechWarrior games for FASA Interactive. He also contributed Matrix-related interior designs to 2013's Shadowrun Returns, connecting him to the 21st century incarnations of the game. And with that, we can pare down 4 more artists. At this point, we have to start going into more details about the interior artwork. And to make this more suspenseful, let's start with those contributors who only worked on a single book and work our way up. So here's a group that I like to call the Singles. Barry Crane provided artwork for the 1989 adventure module Mercurial, a sample of which I've pulled from one of Freddy's videos. His signature can be spotted with the elaborate B in all uppercase letters. This is his only listed credit on RPGgeek.com, but there is also a Barry Crane who does comic book art. Unfortunately, I can't find an image with a clear enough sample of his signature to verify that it's the same artist. If anyone can point me to samples of his work with a similar signature, I'd love to know for certain. Doug Chafee provided art for the color sections of the 1991 Rigger Black Book source material. His RPGgeek.com entry shows him as contributing to Shadowrun well after the first edition with FanPro and Catalyst Game Labs, as well as other companies like Wizards of the Coast and TSR. Sadly, he passed away in 2011, but there are many wiki and art collection sites on the web that pay tribute to his contributions. Carl Martin provided art for the 1989 sourcebook Street Samurai catalog. His signature doesn't appear on any of the character images, so I suspect that he provided the tech images for the various gear entries. He's listed as a designer rather than an illustrator for Steve Jackson Games, West End, and Iron Crown. RPGgeek.com lists a few of his contributions, but I can find little else about him. Tom Peters is another contributor to the 1991 Rigger Black Book. Like Carl Martin, he was a regular contributor to the Mega Traveler game system and its companion magazine Challenge. Peters has his own DeviantArt page under the name Thomas Peters, and it's quite clear that he was another source of the 3D art that formed the basis for the sketches in other parts of the Rigger Black Book. His contributions to games is considerable, with credits for West End Games, FASA, Traveler, and GURPS. Dennis Nelson provided art for the 1991 Rigger Black Book. He drew much of the sketched vehicle art that can be found on page 99 and onward, and his art is easily distinguished by the block letter initials DN. He also provided artwork for Earthdawn, Renegade Legion, and Battletech, but I'm not able to find any of the resources that could direct me to more of his art. Terry Pavlet is one of several contributors to the Harlequin campaign book. He provided illustrations for the final chapter, Present, and his signature can be distinguished by its hard corners, sometimes aligned with another part of the image. His credits are substantial, with over 180 entries on RPGgeek.com citing contributions to a multitude of companies and game systems. He passed away in 2022. Many of his detective mystery graphic novels are still in print, and there are several memorial collections of his art on the web, as well as fond recollections from the companies and other artists he worked with. While he isn't one of the SRV artists, I am curious to find out more. I may make a separate video about him later. Carl Waller contributed illustrations to the 1992 adventure module Imago, although that was not his only 1992 contribution, but we'll get back to that later in the video. Waller's signature is often difficult to spot, just KGW with the year. Sometimes vertical, sometimes horizontal. It's like the Where's Waldo of signatures. Luckily, the art itself is easy to distinguish, with high contrast between the light and dark shades of the image. He continued making contributions to Shadowrun well into 2nd edition, as well as other game systems, but also has comic book credits to his name with Dark Horse, Marvel, and several other publishers. And our final artist for single contributions to 1st edition is Carl Wu, what's really the Carls, who provided illustrations for both the black and white and color portions of the 1992 sourcebook Shadowtech. He is also the author, who drew the figures for the color pages in Shadowtech as well as a pair of characters towards the back. His signature can be distinguished at the edge of his illustrations, which contain the Chinese character for Wu that resembles a small human figure. Wu continued to provide contributions for Shadowrun into 2nd edition, as well as cyberpunk material for GURPS, Cyber Generation, and Chrome. So while none of these artists provide Stevie Ray Vaughan related art in 1st edition, we will come back to Carl Waller before we finish up the video. 8 more artists we can check off. We are past the singles and now it's time to get into the doubles. Artists who worked on 2 books. 2 is more than 1, you know. Let's kick things off with Sean R. Cannon. Cannon provided art for the 1991 adventure module Total Eclipse and the DMZ box set. In Total Eclipse, his art can be spotted on page 50 with a trio of figures looking like something from an album cover, which is appropriate since Total Eclipse is a module about kidnapping and band. If anyone knows the photo reference for this image, I'd love to know in the comments. His signature is easily distinguished by the banner with his full name and year. We can also find a few of his sketches and completed art in the DMZ rulebook. His work on page 8 includes graffiti that may reference Motley Crue. In fact, DMZ is full of graffiti related to bands and musicians, and after going through the book, it becomes apparent that the DMZ box set is going to be our biggest resource in the search for Stevie Ray Vaughan references. I can find little else about Sean Cannon though. There are several artists with similar names, and I'm unable to pare down much more. Next up is Chuck Harris, who may or may not be related to Shadowrun regular Rick Harris. Chuck Harris provided art for the Neo-Anarchist's Guide to North America and the DMZ as well. Harris's art can be spotted by his cartoony signature Chaz with the date. Looking at our DMZ art once again, we find Chuck Harris's art on page 11 with a vampire-like creature, and on page 16 of the DMZ, we have our first hit. Chuck Harris is one of our Stevie Ray Vaughan tribute artists. SRV will always live. We also find graffiti for Joel and Tam, which may be a reference to Shadowrun artists Joel Biscay and Tammy Daniel. On page 21, God Rest Your Soul SRV, also by Chuck Harris. Chuck's Chaz signature can be found as a tattoo on the figure's arm. In the Neo-Anarchist's Guide to North America on page 19, SRV lives in our hearts. Page 37, a simple SRV. Page 55, another simple SRV. I can find little else about Chuck Harris, unfortunately. He did continue to produce work for FASA in their Shadowrun and MechWarrior lines, though. Dwayne Luce contributed to the original Shadowrun core rulebook. He provided many of the vehicle illustrations in the gear section, and also created art for a large number of technical readout books for Battletech. His signature can easily be found next to most of his images, simply as Luce. He's also done design work for games and visualizations, which he showcases on his site, dluce.com. He is not a source for the Stevie Ray Vaughan graffiti though. Todd Marsh, who is sometimes credited as Todd F. Marsh, contributed illustrations to the 1989 adventure module DNA DOA and the 1990 sourcebook Paranormal Animals of North America. His art can be spotted from his tiny signature, TF Marsh, often below the figure he's drawn. These are easy to spot in DNA DOA as they are standalone characters with little or no backgrounds. Freddy from RPG Gamer points to many of Marsh's illustrations as having a very 80s tone to them, which makes sense since DNA DOA was likely being put together in 1988 for publication in '89. The artwork in Paranormal Animals of North America is more critter-oriented, and we don't find any environments where we could see background graffiti. Todd Marsh contributed to several previous FASA works in their Star Trek, Doctor Who, and Battletech lines. His last credit on RPGgeek.com is the DNA DOA 2nd edition reprint from 1997. I'm not able to find more information about him, unfortunately. What I do know is that he isn't one of our SRV artists. Our next double contributor is Alex Ross. Yes, that Alex Ross. Marvel's Alex Ross. Kingdom Come Alex Ross. Astro City Covers Alex Ross. Justice Alex Ross. Am I a fan? Yeah, you could say that. But how did FASA manage to snag Alex Ross before he started doing comic book work? Well, FASA was a Chicago-based publisher, so when they began putting together Shadowrun material in 1988 and '89, they may have looked for freelancers at the American Academy of Art in Chicago, which is exactly in the time frame when Alex Ross attended that school. Ross contributed 11 images to the Shadowrun core rulebook, and there's even a Facebook page with quality scans of those works if you want to see them. He signed his work as Alexander in cursive, and he gave himself a Batman shirt. The Tim Burton film was pretty big. Ross is also listed in the credits for the 1989 adventure module Dream Tripper, and I think this image is his, but I'm not quite sure. As cool as it would be if Alex Ross was one of the Stevie Vaughan illustrators, he is unfortunately not among them. But wouldn't it be crazy if there was just some unpublished Alex Ross Shadowrun art from 1989 just sitting in a folder somewhere waiting to be discovered? Alex Ross has his own YouTube channel where you can watch his process and listen to his thoughts on various designs, if you like. Our last double contributor is Tony Sudlow, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. He is also sometimes credited as Anthony or Tony Sudlow with one fewer C and sometimes with or without the W. Sudlow contributed images to the 1991 adventure books Total Eclipse and Elven Fire. His images are easily distinguished by their meticulous pencil blending, which is in sharp contrast to the harsher ink sketching and shading of the regular Shadowrun team. There's also a much stronger horror tone to his work as well. And his signature is clear, a stylized TS, which makes his work even easier to spot. RPG Geek lists Sudlow credits going well into the 2020s, with 4th edition Earthdawn products, third-party Pathfinder work, Magic the Gathering, 2nd edition Shadowrun, as well as some later TSR products. But he is not one of the SRV artists. Sudlow has a Facebook page, The Art of Tony Sudlow, which he updates regularly. 6 more artists checked, one of which is now identified as one of the SRV artists. Time, my friends, to get into the biggies, the artists who contributed to 3 or more books in 1st edition. We brought up Tammy Daniel once already. A possible reference to her, Tam, shows up in the DMZ and the Neo-Anarchist art by Chuck Harris. Tammy Daniel contributed to the art of 1989's Mercurial, 1990's Seattle Sourcebook, and 1991's Virtual Realities. Those are also her only credits listed on RPGgeek.com. Her work in Mercurial can be somewhat hard to spot, as there are several images without signatures in that book. There's graffiti, Tam was here, on the spread that covers pages 56 and 57, but this could be the work of Rick Harris or Chuck Harris, who both often put references to their fellow artists in their backgrounds. Her work in the Seattle Sourcebook is easier to spot on page 106, as is her signature, which merges the T and the D. I do wish I could find more information about Daniel, since she clearly left a big enough impression to have her name in so many backgrounds. With 3 entries in 1st edition, we have Steve Venters. Venters contributed art to the 1989 core rulebook, Street Samurai catalog, and the cover of Sprawl Sites. I'll admit I can't make out exactly which images are credited to Steve Venters in the core rulebook. Unfortunately, some of the core rulebook images have either no credit or have the credits cropped out of the image. However, it's possible that Venters is credited in the core rulebook because there's an ad for the Street Samurai catalog in the back, for which he drew the cover image. The Street Samurai catalog cover itself is highly detailed, but like a few of the images inside, there is no distinctive signature. The same goes for the Sprawl Sites cover. He did continue to contribute to RPG works, including Shadowrun for 4th edition and other game systems. With so few samples to go on, it's clear he's not one of the 1st edition SRV artists. Next with 4 entries is Larry McDougall. McDougall contributed to the art of 1990's Harlequin Chapter of Future and 1991's Native American Nations Volume 1 and Volume 2 and the DMZ boxed game. His art is very distinctive. You can get a good impression of his style in the work seen here in the Harlequin Chapter of Futures, for which he is the exclusive contributor, and Native American Nations. The signature is a stylized LM, which almost looks like a lowercase tm. He has several urban images in DMZ, but no references to Stevie Ray Vaughan. His RPG contributions continue into the 2020s with works for Earthdawn, multiple branches of the Worlds of Darkness like Mage, Wraith, Changeling, Vampire, and others. There is a Tumblr page dedicated to his Shadowrun art. He also has his own Instagram and website for his business, which I wish I could show you, but it's maybe not YouTube safe. Dan Smith made several art contributions in the later part of the 1st edition lifecycle. You can see his work in 1992's Shadowtech, Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life, Imago, and One Stage Before. Smith's art is very easy to spot. Not only does he make very high contrast art with solid ink on white, with no halftones, no grayscale, and very little hatchwork, but his signature has a distinctive cartoony outline to it. With all of his art contributions so late in the 1st edition lifecycle though, we won't find any references snuck into the background of his work. Neither of the Dan Smith entries at RPG.com point to his previous or current work. There is a DeviantArt page that has works that match his signature though, Smith Inc., if you want to check it out. Janet Alizio made 5 contributions to 1st edition. These include Native American Nations Volume 1 and 2 along with Elven Fire in 1991 and Shadow Beat and One Stage Before in 1992. Her black and white art can be identified by its dense cross-hatching, often over a solid black or solid white background. Her signature is pretty much just a signature when it appears at all. She also contributed color art, and I find that her layers tend to each have a distinct color palette all their own, which helps her work stand out from others in the sourcebook color sections. But there's little graffiti to be found in her work, or any references to Stevie Ray Vaughan. She continues to make RPG art into the 2020s, with works in Earth Dawn and various third-party D&D supplements, as well as Magic the Gathering. She also made cover art for various sci-fi and fantasy short story magazines. You can easily find lots of Spotlight, Pinterest, Tumblr, and blog pages dedicated to her work, but I can't seem to find a page that is specifically her own. If you know of such a site, I'd love to hear about it. Our last illustrator before we get into the regulars is Mike Nielsen. Mike Nielsen's work started appearing in first edition with DMZ and the cover of Harlequin in 1990, followed by interior work and color material for 1991's Virtual Reality, Rigger Black Book, London Sourcebook, and Native American Nations Volume 2, then in 1992 with Shadowbeat and the Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life. The London Sourcebook credits him as Mike Leslie Nielsen, likely a reference to the popular Naked Gun movies at the time. Nielsen's somewhat cartoony Shadowrun art can be spotted by its use of graduated hash marks with pencil work going from light to dark steadily. However, some are done with thick inks, like his selections from the Rigger Black Book. His signature is a simple angled box with Mike N in it, along with the date. It looks like he's spelled Miken, though. He is fond of background graffiti. On page 57 of DMZ, we have what looks like Stacy and Mike along the edge. This shot on page 11 of Shadowbeat seems to be in his style, but also crops out the signature. This image of a rocker on page 15 has a more distinct signature, but also some grayscale work. But we find no references to Stevie Ray Vaughan in his art. There is also a Mike Nielsen who did game design work for Vor as well as the Shadowrun trading card game, but I'm not able to find a specific page collecting his artwork. But that's it for this set of artists. 6 more checked. And now we come to the regulars, frequent contributors across all of first edition and many of the artists who helped define its look for new players like myself. With 11 credits, we start off with Earl Geyer. Geyer contributed to 1989's core rulebook, The Silver Angel Adventure, included with the GM screen, Sprawl Sites, Mercurial, and Dream Chipper, 1990's Neo-Anarchist Guide to North America, Universal Brotherhood, DMZ, 1991's Ivy and Chrome, and 1992's Shadowbeat and the Neo-Anarchist's Guide to Real Life. He also provides art for Harlequin, for which he does the chapters Loves and Counterstroke. He is the only Shadowrun regular with credits in 2 chapters. Geyer has a simple and distinct signature consisting of just his last name. When I first started going through samples of his work, I will admit that I had a little trouble distinguishing his art from Rick Harris. I find that Harris's Shadowrun art tends to use more inks on his figures, and his hair is drawn as more of a mass with some ink lines for details. Geyer's figures are more hatched and their hair lines are more defined with multiple strands. I also noticed that Geyer portrays the Seattle Knights a little more chilly than Harris. Geyer's art also provides Shadowrun with a very kinetic look, portraying characters posed in a way that makes it look like they're about to spring into action, midway through action, or just finishing action. He also did several mostly ink images like this one from Dream Chipper. Geyer has stuck with the RPG scene all the way to today, with credits on RPGgeek.com running for 47 pages and credits with a multitude of companies and game systems. I've found no images of his, however, with references to Stevie Ray Vaughan, although his rare graffiti does point to other things. He has a DeviantArt page with samples of his work, as well as several fan pages highlighting his contributions. We've talked a little about him already, but it's time to look into Rick Harris. Although credited on 12 books, Harris often makes a large volume of contributions to each book, with shady characters involved in one Shadowrunnery situation or another. His first edition credits consist of 1989's core rulebook, DNA DOA and Mercurial, 1990's Grimoire, Queen Euphoria, Bottle Demon, Neo-Anarchist Guide to North America, and DMZ, 1991's Native American Nations Volume 1, Dragon Hunt, Total Eclipse, and Ivy and Chrome. Strangely, Rick Harris is the only Shadowrun regular who doesn't have a chapter in Harlequin. Harris's signature is easy to spot. It's simply his first and last name, sometimes incorporated into the background graffiti. Like I mentioned before, Harris uses more ink on his figures compared to Geyer, but more hatching and line-based shadows used in the backgrounds. His level of detail varies from image to image, but in one of the Neo-Anarchist books we can see a close-up Decker character showing just how intricate Harris's work can really get. In reference to Stevie Ray Vaughan, though, in the first edition Grimoire, we have this somewhat familiar-looking figure. The hair, I'll admit, is quite a bit different, and the guitar isn't an early 60s Stratocaster. It's when we get to the DMZ rulebook that things get a lot clearer. On page 13, we find Stevie Ray Lives, alongside references to fellow Shadowrun artists Tim Bradstreet, Dean Knudsen, Joel Biskey, and Jeff Lobenstein, as well as regular layout artist Tara Gallagher. There's also a reference to blues guitarist Blind Lemon Jefferson. On page 29, a simple SRV, and this is the last reference by Rick Harris in the first edition. There is some homage graffiti for other bands and musicians in later work though. In Queen Euphoria, Teenage Wasteland appears possibly in reference to the still popular Who song Baba O'Reilly. There is also Sunny Lives, but it's tough to pare down exactly which Sunny this is. In Battle Demon we have Fascination Street in reference to the song by The Cure. Rick Harris has provided art for Battletech and a range of other game systems like GURPS, Torg, D&D Traveler, and others. He pops up in tons of wiki pages from sites related to RPG art, but I'm not able to find any pages of his own. If anyone knows of such a site, I'd love to check it out. And he is definitely one of our Stevie Ray Vaughan tribute artists. Dana Knutson didn't just make art for Shadowrun, he also served as art director for the vast majority of the first edition books, and definitely deserves credit for the consistent look of the setting across so many artists. He contributed art to 1989's core rulebook and maps for Dream Tripper, 1990's Paranormal Animals of North America, DMC, and the cover of the Seattle Sourcebook, 1991's Rigger Black Book, Native American Nations Volume 2, maps for Dragon Hunt, and ads for the London Sourcebook, and 1992's Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life, and the cover of Shadowbeat. Knudsen produced 2 of the large character collages for DMZ. His signature is simply his name, but in very tiny letters, sometimes aligned with the curve of the image. Dana Knudsen left FASA in 1992 and included a tiny farewell message in the Grimoire 2nd edition, "Farewell FASA, and thanks," but otherwise doesn't hide references to other things in his art, as far as I can tell. This makes him easy to exclude as one of our SRV tribute artists. He went on to work at TSR and Wizards of the Coast, creating some of the most defining images of the Planescape campaign setting. He even appears in the D&D art documentary, Eye of the Beholder. Now, if you thought it was crazy that FASA managed to get art from Alex Ross before he got into the comic industry, here's another one for you. Tim Bradstreet. One of the most defining artists for the John Constantine Hellblazer and Marvel Punisher comics, is heavily featured in early Shadowrun. Bradstreet produced art for 13 first edition books, 1989's Core Rulebook, the Street Samurai Catalog, DNA DOA, Mercurial, and Dream Tripper, where he is credited simply as Street. 1990's Grimoire, Queen Euphoria, Bottle Demon, DMZ, and the Harlequin chapter Hates, and 1991's Native American Nations Volume 1 and 2, and Ivy and Chrome. When I think about playing a Shadowrun character or portraying an NPC in Shadowrun, I tend to think about them in terms of Tim Bradstreet's art. It helps that Bradstreet is really good at drawing guns and motorcycles, and if you're playing Shadowrun, you're probably going to have at least one of those 2 in the game. He does use lots of photo references for his poses, but that actually elevates the gang and gangster, very cultured and live-in feel of Shadowrun. And then there's this image from Ivy and Chrome? Is anyone seeing what I'm seeing? I can't be the only one, right? Bradstreet's signature is very easy to spot, sometimes just his last name, and other times his full name within a circle. And it turns out he is one of our Stevie Ray Vaughan artists. It's tiny and easy to miss, but on page 61 of the DMZ rulebook, SRV, RIP. Trade paperbacks featuring Tim Bradstreet's comic book art are reprinted to this day. Copies of his own art book and sketchbook series are out of print right now and sell at fairly elevated prices. James Nelson is sometimes also credited as Jim Nelson, and he provided art for 20 first edition works including 2 covers. He is credited in 1989's Core Rulebook, the GM Screen/Silver Angel, Sprawl Sites, and Dream Chipper, 1990's Paranormal Animals of North America, the Grimoire, Seattle Sourcebook, Neo-Anarchist Guide to North America, Universal Brotherhood, DMZ, and the Harlequin chapter Physical. 1991's Virtual Realities, Rigger Black Book, Native American Nations Volume 1 and 2, the London Sourcebook, Dragon Hunt, and 1992's Shadowbeat, Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life, and One Stage Before. James Nelson provided 2 of the 2-page spread images for DMZ and is also responsible for much of the icon and logo art that you see in early Shadowrun, especially in the art portraying the Matrix as well as some of the vehicle art in the Rigger Black Book. His signature is not always easy to spot and consists of just his last name and sometimes the year. He also has a digital version of his signature for his Matrix art. There are a small number of images where Nelson is credited alongside Joel Bisky, who I'll get to shortly. These are the only collaborative images in first edition. Jim Nelson continued to work for FASA well into 2nd edition before moving on to Wizards of the Coast to work on D&D and Magic the Gathering. He is not one of Stevie Ray Vaughan tribute artists though. His own Blogspot page was last updated in 2018, but he also has his own art page, jimnelsonart.com, with some of his more recent contributions to Hearthstone. Our second most frequent artist in Shadowrun is Jeff Lobenstein, with 21 books. Lobenstein is credited in 1989's Core Rulebook, GM Screen/Silver Angel, Sprawl Sites, Street Samurai Catalog, Mercurial including its cover, and Dream Chipper, 1990s Paranormal Animals of North America, Grimoire, Seattle Sourcebook, Neo-Anarchist Guide to North America, Universal Brotherhood, DMZ, and the past chapter of Harlequin, 1991's Rigger Black Book, Native American Nations Volume 1 and 2, including 2's cover, Vlemen's Sourcebook, Dragon Hunt, and Elven Fire, and 1992's Shadow Beat, Shadowtech, and Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life. Across multiple books, Lovenstein provided color and black and white art for the archetypes, pre-generated characters that players could just grab and start playing. Also, many of the contact pages and source books and adventure modules would feature his art as well. He also made big contributions to the setting's population of critters, including this 2-page spread from DMZ. His signature can be a small pair of initials JL or his full last name with the year. Lovenstein's art is distinctive with lots of expression in the wrinkles, warts, and tusks, and similar details on the fingers. When he draws a relatively fair character, it actually stands out quite a bit. Prior to Shadowrun, he also provided art for the Mech Warrior setting, and he would later make contributions to Magic the Gathering. He has his own Instagram and Facebook pages if you want to keep up with his work and travels. Before we get to the final illustrator for Shadowrun 1st Edition, I'd like to give some mention to Tara Gallagher. Gallagher only provided illustration work for 1990 Seattle Sourcebook, which ones are hers I'm not sure. Most of the ads in the Seattle Sourcebook aren't credited. But besides that, she also acted as the layout artist for 29 out of 30 of the 1st Edition works we've talked about in this video, with 1992's Imago being the only one where she was absent. I've been able to find little else about her, unfortunately. Our final artist and contributor to 24 1st Edition Shadowrun books is Joel Biscay, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. Biscay is credited with illustration in Deep Breath, 1989's Core Will book, GM's Green/Silver Angel, including its cover, Mercurial and Dream Chipper, 1990's Paranormal Animals of North America, Grimoire, Seattle Sourcebook, Neo-Anarchist Guide to North America, including the cover, Universal Brotherhood, Queen Euphoria, Bottled Demon, DMZ, and the Harlequin Chapter Spiritual, 1991's Virtual Realities, the Rigger Black Book, the London Sourcebook, including some of the color sections, Dragon Hunt, Total Eclipse, Elven Fire, including its cover, and Ivy and Chrome, and 1992's Shadow Beat, Shadowtech, the Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life, Imago, and One Stage Before. Biscay's black and white work has a wide range of styles, some with 2 to 3 grayscale tones, some with what looks like airbrush textures, some with hatching. He draws figures, faces, architecture, vehicles, magical powers, and matrix spaces. And it seems to be mandatory to include Biscay's art in any Shadowrun product with insect spirits. But his color art really stands out. I'll stop talking for a moment and just let these speak for themselves. There are 2 signatures associated with his art, one more plain and one more stylized. If you're not used to a stylized signature, it can be hard to make out. And he does like a bit of graffiti in his art. Here in Silver Angel, we can see Hi Tam, possibly in reference to Tammy Daniel, and Chuck Was Here, possibly a reference to Chuck Harris, who also likes to leave messages in his graffiti. But in the DMZ archetypes, we have our most telling sample of his graffiti, SRV 82790, referencing the exact day of Stevie Ray Vaughan's fatal helicopter crash. And directly below that graffiti, a man in a loose-fitting suit, shoulder-length hair, and a wide black hat with a metallic accent. And so it would seem that Joel Biscay is our final Stevie Ray Vaughan enthusiast. After FASA, Joel Biscay worked in freelance with various clients, including Walt Disney Feature Animations. He currently works for a design company in Florida and has a Wix page where you can see samples of his art and design work. And so that is our list. Chuck Harris, Rick Harris, Tim Bradstreet, and Joel Biscay. Artwork in Grimoire, DMZ, and the Neo-Anarchist Guide to North America. And that's that. Sort of. See, here's the thing. For the longest time I thought that my copy of the Shadowrun Grimoire was the 1st Edition Grimoire. Everything in it is fully compatible with 1st Edition after all. But it's not. It's 2nd Edition. And within its pages, you'll find this image. Loose-fitting shirt, early 60s Fender Stratocaster guitar body. And so it would seem that Rick Harris's mysterious blues shaman from the 1st Edition Grimoire lived on into Shadowrun in 2nd Edition thanks to the art of Carl Waller. Many of the Shadowrun artists also produced art for White Wolf and other companies during the same time period, and I sometimes wonder what I'd find in Vampire 1st Edition products around 1990. And what about Mech Warrior 2nd Edition? It came out in 1991 but was likely being put together months earlier, so maybe the rabbit hole goes a little deeper. My evenings these days aren't as late, my hours are spent at a computer desk rather than a checkout counter, my commute is a scant 6 miles. I do pretty well, and I'm not as hungry or get as hungover anymore. I also see a lot less neon these days. We've swapped it for LED lights and screens. We have VR and AI, but they aren't the productivity tools that we thought they'd be. I recently rented a car that could center itself in a lane and follow at a safe distance on its own, but the technology isn't entirely trustworthy, so you still have to keep your hand on the wheel or it will disengage on its own. Digital currencies seem to have become the stuff of scams and pump and dump schemes, and anyone with a camera and a microphone can have their own TV channel shared across the world. And if you make cartoons, you don't even need the camera. You know, as much as cyberpunk is associated with futuristic electronic music, I can't help but find that as we get closer to that setting, it puts me more in the mood for the blues. Just the right song at just the right time to finish up each day. Have you ever found an unexpected surprise in the background of your favorite works? Let me know in the comments, hit all the usual YouTube buttons, and happy gaming.